5 times American soldiers died not from enemy bullets, but from their own side's weapons. These are the incidents veterans specifically requested we cover, the ones that reveal the brutal truth about friendly fire in Vietnam. This isn't sanitized military history. This is raw, unfiltered reality about how American firepower turned against the men it was supposed to protect. If you think you know about Vietnam's dangers, you know half the story. The Viet Cong and NVA were one threat, but American artillery, American bombs, and American bullets killed hundreds of U.S. soldiers in incidents that military records tried to minimize or bury entirely. What you're about to hear comes from declassified after-action reports, combat documentation, and veteran testimony that took decades to surface. These 5 incidents show exactly how modern warfare's overwhelming firepower became a double-edged sword that cut through American lines. This separates those who know combat reality from those still learning it. Let's get into it. Vietnam introduced American forces to a new kind of warfare, one where the front lines didn't exist, where every tree line could hide the enemy, and where calling in fire support meant trusting coordinates shouted over static-filled radios in the middle of chaos. The result was inevitable, friendly fire incidents that military studies would later classify as tragically common. According to Declassified Department of Defense research, approximately 10–14% of American combat deaths in Vietnam resulted from friendly fire, a rate higher than any modern American conflict. That translates to roughly 8,000 casualties from American weapons. But beyond the statistics lie specific incidents that reveal exactly how these tragedies unfolded. These 5 incidents represent different aspects of the friendly fire crisis: navigation errors, communication breakdowns, identification failures, and the simple brutal fact that when you saturate a jungle with explosive ordnance, you can't always control where it lands. Each incident illuminates a different vulnerability in the American tactical system, vulnerabilities that cost lives in the most bitter way possible. The emotional stakes couldn't be higher. These men survived enemy ambushes only to die from their own side's firepower. The 173rd Airborne Brigade fought for 4 days to take Hill 875 during Operation MacArthur. On the 4th day, as American paratroopers finally secured the hilltop, a U.S. Air Force F-100 Super Sabre dropped 2 500-pound bombs directly on the American position. 42 paratroopers died instantly. Another 45 were wounded. The bitter irony cuts deep. They survived waves of NVA attacks, climbed through hell to take that hill, then died celebrating victory. Let's break down why this incident represents the worst nightmare of close air support. Forward. Air controllers directed strikes from L-19 observation aircraft flying above the battle. The FAC provided coordinates to the F-100 pilot, but critical information failed to transmit clearly. According to military records, radio interference from the surrounding mountains created gaps in transmission. The pilot heard grid coordinates that placed the target 200 meters from the actual American position, but 200 meters in dense jungle canopy looks identical from 8,000 feet altitude. The pilot saw what he thought was the bunker complex the FAC described. He rolled in for the attack run, released ordnance, and pulled up, standard procedure. Veterans on the ground described seeing the flash of the bombs separating from the aircraft, then realizing with absolute horror that the trajectory was wrong. One paratrooper stated in documented interviews, "We started screaming into the radio, but it was too late. You can't call back a bomb once it's falling." 2 500-pound Mark 82 bombs carried 192 pounds of tritonal explosive each. The blast radius in open terrain reaches 100 meters. In the confined space of Hill 875's summit, where American forces had concentrated in defensive positions, the effect was catastrophic. The bombs detonated within seconds of each other, 40 feet apart, creating overlapping kill zones that caught men in bunkers, foxholes, and open ground. The fragmentation pattern shredded everything within 75 meters. Veterans who survived described a wall of pressure that lifted bodies into the air, followed by a rain of dirt, tree fragments, and human remains. The explosion created a crater 12 feet deep and 30 feet across. One sergeant later described in oral histories, "The screaming started immediately, but not the kind you hear in war movies. This was different. These were our brothers. and we'd killed them ourselves. The psychological scar. For the survivors of Hill 875, the trauma wasn't just about witnessing death. It was about the betrayal of trust. Close air support was supposed to be the lifeline that saved American units in trouble. Instead, it became the weapon that killed more men than the 4-day NVA assault. Veterans consistently describe a fundamental shift in how they viewed air support after Hill 875. The sound of approaching jets, which previously brought relief, now triggered panic. One lieutenant stated in his after-action testimony, "Every time I heard aircraft engines after that, my gut clenched. I'd start calculating blast radius before I even knew what they were targeting." The incident created lasting PTSD, specifically around air support operations, distinct from general combat trauma. But the second incident went even deeper into the nightmare of misidentification. An Australian infantry company operating in Phuoc Thai province called for American artillery support during a nighttime defensive position. U.S. 155mm howitzers from the 1st Field Regiment fired a barrage that landed directly on the Australian perimeter, killing 24 soldiers and wounding 21 others. The devastating detail: Australian forces had provided correct coordinates, but the American Fire Direction Center miscalculated by 500 meters due to a map reading error. Allied forces died because someone transposed numbers. Let's break down why this incident reveals the fragility of artillery coordination. Artillery fire direction requires converting grid coordinates from maps to firing data for the guns. The process involves multiple steps: plotting the target location, measuring the distance and bearing from the gun position, calculating elevation and charge based on distance, then applying corrections for weather and terrain. According to military documentation, the error occurred during the initial plotting phase. A junior NCO in the Fire Direction Center read the grid coordinates as 850-342 instead of 850-842, a single-digit transposition that shifted the impact point 500 meters west. In the dense jungle of Phuoc Thui, 500 meters meant the difference between hitting enemy positions and hitting the Australian defensive line. The calculated firing data was correct for the wrong location. 6 M114 155mm howitzers fired 30 rounds in rapid succession, each shell carrying 15 pounds of TNT and thousands of steel fragments. The Australian company had established a standard defensive perimeter with foxholes, observation posts, and interlocking fields of fire. When the first shells landed, they assumed they were under mortar attack from the Viet Cong and immediately radioed for the prearranged artillery support, not realizing they were calling for more of the same fire that was killing them. 3 additional volleys hit the perimeter before the Australian forward observer identified the shells as American 155mm rounds based on their distinctive sound and fragmentation pattern. By then, the damage was catastrophic. One Australian corporal described in documented testimony, "Blokes were screaming for medics while also screaming to cease fire on the radio." The worst part was knowing our own request for help was bringing more shells down on us. The artillery fired 42 rounds total before the ceasefire order reached the gun line, a delay of nearly 4 minutes from first impact. For Australian forces who relied on American artillery throughout their Vietnam deployment, this incident shattered operational confidence. Veterans consistently describe a fundamental reluctance to call for fire support after Operation Hurricane, even in desperate situations. The psychological calculation changed. Was the enemy threat severe enough to risk American artillery errors? One platoon commander stated in oral history interviews, "I'd rather face a VC company with just our rifles than risk another fire mission that might land on us. At least we could see the enemy and shoot back." The incident damaged Australian-American tactical cooperation for months, creating hesitation at the exact moments when decisive fire support could have saved lives. But the third incident involved a threat even more immediate than artillery. A U.S. Marine patrol returning to Firebase Buttons in Quang Nam province walked into an ambush from their own perimeter guards. 7 Marines died and 4 were wounded in 45 seconds of sustained fire before the unit could identify itself. The guards had been told to expect a Viet Cong probe and fired on movement outside the wire without verification. The brutal detail: the patrol had radioed ahead with their return time and route, but the information never reached the guard posts. Let's break down why this incident exposes the terror of perimeter security failures. Firebase security operated on a simple principle. Anything moving outside the wire after dark was enemy. Patrols leaving or returning required coordination between the patrol leader, the Firebase Operations Center, and the perimeter guard posts. According to after-action reports, the returning patrol had contacted the operations bunker 30 minutes before reaching the perimeter, providing their estimated time of arrival and approach direction from the southwest. The operations NCO logged the information, but failed to notify the guard positions due to shift change confusion. The incoming NCO had no record of the patrol's return schedule. When the guards saw movement 100 meters out in the darkness, they followed standing orders. Challenge once, then fire. One surviving Marine described in official testimony, "We heard halt and started to respond when the entire tree line lit up. M60s, M16s, grenade launchers, everything. We hit the ground screaming, 'Friendly, friendly!' But they couldn't hear us over their own fire." The Firebase Buttons perimeter featured overlapping fields of fire designed to stop massed infantry attacks. 3 M60 machine gun positions covered the southwestern approach, each with pre-plotted fire lanes and interlocking coverage. When the guards opened fire, they executed the defensive plan perfectly, sweeping the kill zone with 550 rounds per minute of 7.62 mm fire from multiple angles. The patrol had nowhere to go. Running forward meant advancing into fire. Running backward meant exposing themselves in the open. Lying flat offered the only chance, but the M60 gunners were trained to fire low, keeping rounds 2 to 3 feet above ground to catch crawling attackers. The sustained fire lasted 45 seconds, approximately 100 rounds downrange. Veterans who survived described tracers crisscrossing overhead like a web of light, with the impact sounds of bullets hitting trees, rocks, and flesh creating a deafening cacophony. One machine gunner later stated through tears in documented interviews, "I could hear someone screaming, 'Cease fire,' but I thought it was the enemy trying to trick us. I kept firing. I killed my own friends because I followed the rules." The aftermath of Firebase Buttons created a unit-wide psychological crisis. The guards who fired faced crushing guilt despite following proper procedures. The patrol survivors faced rage at the system that nearly killed them all. Veterans consistently described this incident as creating permanent divisions within the unit. Men who couldn't look at each other, couldn't trust the defensive systems meant to protect them, and developed intense anxiety about perimeter operations. One lieutenant who witnessed the aftermath described in oral histories, "Some guys stopped going on patrol entirely. Others refused guard duty. The Firebase stopped functioning as a cohesive unit because everyone knew the biggest threat wasn't Charlie, it was us." But the fourth incident revealed an even darker aspect of friendly fire. An AC-47 spooky gunship, responding to a ground unit's call for fire support, strafed a U.S. Army platoon for nearly 2 minutes, killing 16 soldiers and wounding 23 others. The platoon had correctly marked their position with strobe lights and smoke grenades, but the gunship crew misidentified the signals as enemy deception tactics. The devastating irony, the platoon survived a Viet Cong ambush only to be destroyed by the rescue aircraft. Let's break down why this incident shows the lethal danger of aerial misidentification. AC-47 gunships carried 3 7.62 mm miniguns, capable of firing 6,000 rounds per minute combined, essentially turning the aircraft into a flying artillery platform. Standard procedure required ground units to mark friendly positions with infrared strobes visible through the gunship's night vision equipment. According to declassified reports, the platoon activated 2 infrared strobes and popped orange smoke after the VC ambush broke contact. But intelligence reports had recently warned that Viet Cong forces were captured infrared equipment to create false signals and lure gunships into wasting ammunition or exposing flight patterns. The gunship pilot, a veteran of 47 combat missions, saw the strobes in an area where recent intelligence placed VC activity and made a split-second judgment: enemy deception. One crew member stated in official inquiries, "The pilot said, 'They're trying to fake us out,' and rolled in for a gun run. We trusted his experience. We trusted the intelligence. We were wrong." Each minigun fired 2,000 rounds per minute, in a pattern that covered an area 40 feet wide and 80 feet long, the footprint of death. With 3 guns firing, the AC-47 saturated the target zone with 6,000 rounds in 120 seconds of continuous fire. The 7.62mm rounds tore through jungle canopy, vegetation, and human bodies without discrimination. The platoon had taken cover in a bomb crater from the earlier VC ambush, concentrating in a space roughly 30 feet across, directly in the center of the gunship's fire pattern. Veterans who survived described the sound as incomprehensible, a roar that overwhelmed all other senses. Rounds impacted at a rate faster than individual shots could be distinguished, creating a sustained thunder punctuated by the screams of wounded men. One private who lost both legs in the attack described in medical evaluations, "You couldn't see the bullets coming. You just felt impacts all around you, saw guys exploding into red mist, and knew you were next. There was nowhere to run." The platoon's radio operator desperately transmitted ceasefire orders throughout the gun run, but the gunship crew maintained radio discipline during attack runs to avoid distraction. By the time the pilot completed the first pass and opened his radio channel, 90 seconds had elapsed. The second gun run had already begun. The pilot heard the frantic ceasefire calls and aborted immediately, but another 30 seconds of fire had already impacted the position. Veterans consistently described this incident as uniquely traumatic because of the helplessness. They could do nothing but wait to die while their own aircraft killed them. One squad leader who survived uninjured physically but developed severe PTSD stated in psychiatric evaluations, "I watched half my platoon die while I screamed into a radio that no one was listening to. I still hear those screams. I still hear the guns." But the fifth and final incident represents perhaps the most preventable tragedy of all. During a nighttime mortar attack by the NVA, American 81mm mortar crews at FSB Mary Ann fired counter-battery missions that landed short, hitting the base's own defensive positions and living quarters. 30 American soldiers died, with 82 wounded. Casualties nearly equal to the NVA attack itself. The cause? Improperly calculated firing tables and faulty ammunition charges that reduced range by 150 meters. Let's break down why this incident epitomizes the technical failures that enabled friendly fire. Indirect fire weapons like the 81mm mortar require precise calculations to hit targets. Crews must account for the weapon's elevation, the propellant charge, the projectile weight, and environmental factors like temperature and altitude. At FSB Mary Ann, the mortar crews used firing tables calculated for sea level conditions, but the firebase sat at 850 feet elevation, enough to significantly affect trajectory. Additionally, the propellant increments had been exposed to monsoon humidity for 3 weeks, degrading their power by approximately 12%. According to military investigations, these combined factors reduced the mortar's maximum range by 150 meters. When crews calculated fire missions to hit suspected NVA mortar positions 800 meters away, the rounds actually traveled only 650 meters, landing directly in the firebase's eastern defensive sector. One mortar team leader stated in official testimony, "We did everything by the book. The math was right for the tables we had. Nobody told us the tables were wrong for our location. The 81mm mortar fires a 10-pound projectile that fragments into hundreds of deadly shards within a 35-meter radius. FSB Mary Ann's mortar section fired 18 rounds in rapid succession, attempting to suppress the enemy mortars. All 18 rounds impacted within the base perimeter. The first round hit near the aid station, killing 2 medics and 4 wounded soldiers awaiting evacuation. Subsequent rounds walked through the defensive bunker line, collapsing positions and killing soldiers in their fighting holes. The final rounds hit the living area where off-duty soldiers had taken cover, penetrating the sandbag roofs and exploding inside the bunkers. Veterans who witnessed the attack describe utter chaos. Soldiers couldn't tell which explosions were incoming NVA rounds and which were American mortars, creating panic that prevented effective response. One lieutenant who survived described in after-action reports, "We were running between bunkers trying to organize defense when our own mortars started landing. I saw a bunker take a direct hit, then watched as 3 more American rounds walked right through our lines. The NVA only fired maybe 40 rounds total. We killed more of our own guys than they did." the institutional failure. What makes the FSB Mary Ann incident particularly bitter is the preventability. Firing tables should have been updated for local conditions. Ammunition should have been stored properly and tested. Crews should have been trained to conduct range verification fires before combat operations. According to military regulations, all these procedures were required. None were followed. The investigation revealed a pattern of negligence: inexperienced officers, inadequate training, poor supply discipline, and a general degradation of standards in the final years of American ground combat operations. Veterans consistently describe this incident as proof that by 1971, the military system in Vietnam was breaking down at fundamental levels. One sergeant major who served at Mary Ann stated in congressional testimony, "We weren't just fighting the NVA, we were fighting our own incompetence, and our incompetence was winning." What connects all 5 incidents is the same brutal truth. American military power was so overwhelming, so omnipresent, and so imperfectly controlled that it became as dangerous to U.S. forces as the enemy. Unlike conventional warfare, where front lines separate friendly and enemy positions, Vietnam's 360-degree battlefield meant American firepower was always close, sometimes too close. These weren't random accidents. They were systemic failures embedded in how modern military technology operated in an unconventional war. The communication systems that couldn't penetrate jungle interference, the maps that lacked precision in unmapped terrain, the identification systems that failed in conditions where everyone wore the same mud-covered uniforms, the artillery and air support designed for open European battlefields, deployed instead in dense jungle where 200-meter errors meant death. Declassified military psychiatric research conducted in the 1980s revealed that friendly fire survivors developed distinct PTSD patterns compared to conventional combat trauma. The betrayal aspect, being harmed by forces meant to protect, created deeper psychological wounds that resisted treatment. Veterans of these incidents reported higher rates of trust issues, authority problems, and social isolation decades after the war ended. The scope of friendly fire in Vietnam remains difficult to quantify precisely. Official Department of Defense estimates acknowledge 8,000 casualties, but military historians studying combat records suggest the actual number could reach 12,000, 15,000, when including incidents that were misclassified or never properly investigated. These 5 incidents alone killed 119 American and Allied soldiers, men who survived enemy fire only to die from their own side's weapons. These weren't just soldiers defined by rank and serial number. They were young men, average age 19, who trusted the system to protect them. They trusted that when they called for help, help would arrive, not death from above or behind. They trusted their maps, their radios, their officers, and their fellow soldiers. And in these 5 incidents, that trust was catastrophically betrayed. Over 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam. Thousands more came home carrying wounds that never healed. And for friendly fire survivors, those wounds included the knowledge that their brothers died not from enemy action, but from American mistakes, American technology, and American failures. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, or if you served in any conflict where friendly fire claimed lives, your experiences matter. The military has learned from these tragedies. Modern GPS, digital communications, and improved identification systems have reduced friendly fire rates in recent conflicts. But the lessons came at a terrible cost, paid by men like those at Hill 875, Firebase Buttons, and FSB Mary Ann. If you have stories about these incidents or experiences with friendly fire, please share them in the comments. These histories need to be preserved, so future generations understand the full cost of war. If this video revealed something you didn't know about Vietnam, hit that like button and subscribe for more raw military history. Share this with anyone who needs to understand what friendly fire really means. Thank you for watching.